So, um, my name is Lynn Armstrong, and I'm the chair of the Council Canadians Delta Richmond chapter. I'd like to welcome all of you here to this webinar about the proposed Fortis BC Tilbury LNG expansion. We acknowledge that although we're situated in many places and meeting virtually right now, we're focused on Tilbury Island. And Tilbury Island is in the traditional territories of the Tsawwassen First Nation. Tilbury Island is also in the Fraser River, which has been a lifeline for Coast Salish First Nations for thousands of years. Many people in Delta and Richmond have been concerned about the Tilbury LNG facility, and so when Fortis announced the start of a public engagement period on June 1st, there was a quick rallying and reaching out, which led to the formation of Friends of Tilbury. We welcome you to become involved. The project affects Metro Vancouver in a big way, and we have people involved here from Vancouver and other parts of the Lower Mainland. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll send everyone a link with further information for you, everyone who registered, whether you're on the call or not. And if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and have your name and your location in the chat box. After we've heard from our panelists, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and we'll be using the Q&A function for that. The chat and Q&A buttons are at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is obviously the work of many people, but I'd like to thank three in particular, without whom this particular event would not have happened. They put in many hours on short notice. Tracy Saxby, Executive Director of My Sea to Sky, AJ Klein, Regional Organizer for Council of Canadians, and Owen Finn, LNG Guru, along and also with My Sea to Sky. Thank you all so very much. We're fortunate to have with us two members of the Tsawwassen First Nation. Laura will be speaking later on the panel and would like to introduce Wistania, who graciously agreed to offer a traditional welcome for this gathering. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce to you my community elder. With great respect, Ruth and I have worked together on many projects in Vancouver and area and our home community. Ruth and I both sit on the advisory committee for council, and we're also actively involved in many things that happen within the boundaries and outside of Tsawwassen First Nation. So Ruth, thank you so much for agreeing to join us here tonight, doing the traditional welcome for the Tsawwassen people. And also my husband asked and reminded me that this is also traditional territory of the Musqueam and the Kwantlen and the Semiahmoo people as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ruth, for your welcome and your prayers. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. I do this a second time. Okay, my name is Quistania, and it's my honor to welcome everyone to Tsawwassen First Nation traditional territory along with Musqueam. And I say a short prayer for this. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Dear Creator, please bless everyone that is on this Zoom meeting. Bless them for the work that they do, and also bless all of the other people behind the scenes who are helping these ones that are on Zoom. Bless all of them and their families. It's most important, and special blessings to my First Nation and for Laura Baird for bringing me here to be included and to listen to all of these important issues. So Creator, bless all of us, and bless all of the issues that are going to be going through tonight, and let everyone have an open mind and open ears to everyone that's going to speak. I thank you for this beautiful day, Creator, and thank you for this honor for being here on this Zoom and here with with all of these friends. We thank you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All my relations.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth, so much for that blessing. I'd like to now introduce Peter McCartney, fracking guru, and from the Wilderness Committee. Now, speaking to us today about fracking, people mobilizes communities against destructive fossil fuel export projects and builds political will for a just transition to a post-carbon economy. Welcome, Peter.
Hey, thanks so much, Lynn, and thank you to the Council of Canadians and the Friends of Tilbury for organizing. So the Wilderness Committee has been working on fracking for about 10 years now, and in that time we've really, fracking and LNG, and in that time we've really noticed that people don't make the link between fracking and LNG, and I think a lot of that is because government and industry market it as this environmentally friendly, almost mythical fairy gas that comes from nowhere. But the truth is that almost all of the gas that would be produced by Tilbury comes from fracking projects in northeastern British Columbia, where the environmental impact is massive and the impact on communities in the surrounding region is huge as well. So what exactly is fracking? Fracking is a process by which gas companies use to get gas that was previously inaccessible buried deep underneath the ground in shale rock formations. And basically they use water from local lakes and rivers, combine it with silica sand. Often it has to be mined, and there's a few silica sand proposals in Manitoba. And they combine it with a cocktail of chemicals and inject it deep under the ground at a very high pressure so that it shatters open the rock and allows the gas to escape, and so they can retrieve it. Now, this process has massive health and safety risks for surrounding communities, climate risks, but I know I'm going to allow the other panelists to talk to those in a moment here. I'm really going to focus on the landscape level impacts of fracking. So when you go to northeastern British Columbia, it's really striking how much gas infrastructure is actually on the landscape. Basically, from the Rocky Mountains to the Alberta border and behind, you have well pads, wastewater ponds, processing plants, seismic lines, pipelines, access roads, and this all fragments just a massive amount of habitat up there. It's one of the reasons that the boreal caribou is suffering so much. And this was taken in Farrell Creek. I actually had to stitch it together to get it all in. It's just north of Hudson Hope, and a Soto elder told me, this was his favorite hunting grounds, and he can't actually go up here anymore because it makes it too sad. The infrastructure here just stretches all the way along to the left in the corner. This is in Farmington. There's more, you can see all the way across into the background there, more fracking infrastructure. A local farm family lives just a few minutes from here, and on their back porch in the cold, dark winter, they can see 9 flare stacks sitting on the horizon. The impacts to communities around fracking are immense, and they really it fragments the landscapes that we're looking at here. But lastly, one of the biggest concerns that the Wilderness Committee and everyone should have about fracking is the amount of water that is used. This is near Briar Ridge, and this water truck going into an active fracking well. And, the industry uses over 550,000 of these fracking trucks every year worth of water. It's an absolutely immense amount of water that's been taken from the rivers and water bodies in the region. And eventually all of that will end up underground, where it's basically removed from the water cycle forever. And so, you know, communities in the nearby have faced drought, and actually fracking operations have had to shut down because of the amount of water that's being used and the impacts of climate change. One First Nation in the area actually had over 7 billion liters of water applications in 2 days. So Tilbury Island did the math today and would require around 2,800 new fracking wells in Northeast BC, and that's why we have to stop it. So that's the end of my little presentation. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Warren Bell, who will be speaking about human health impacts. Who'll be speaking about human health impacts. Warren has been a family physician for over 4 decades and is the past founding president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. For over 3 decades, he has been concerned with issues of social development, global health, and the environment. Over to you, Warren.
Thank you very much, Peter. And good evening, everybody. I'm going to show some slides that will outline what the health impacts are with respect to LNG. And I'm going to begin by emphasizing a point that Peter made, which is that LNG and fracking are essentially the same. 85% at least of the gas used for producing LNG comes from fracking sources. And in addition, it also involves harms to human health. So the three go together. You can't have LNG without fracking, and you can't have fracking without harms to human health. Now, most of us became very used to our former premier nattering on endlessly about the benefits and the safety of natural gas and LNG, never, of course, using the word fracking, but because she wanted to obscure that source. We thought that the next premier, the current premier, would change things, especially with a green, three-member green alliance. But in fact, he has been exactly the same. And this is a picture with the president of, the CEO rather, of LNG Canada in the background, where he's extolling the virtues of LNG as well. So beneath all this beautiful chat about LNG is this very black and unpleasant world of fracking and its effects on human beings. And I'm going to focus on that. It's been going on for over 2 decades, the kind of fracking that is done today that Peter was talking about, which is deep underground and has multiple lateral pipes that also allow for extensive work. At the same time, the science of fracking harms has been desperately trying to catch up to what's been going on in the industrial world. We do know some things about harms caused by fracking. There are harms from air and water pollution. I'm going quickly because we don't have much time. It's now demonstrated that the fetus and newborns, mostly the fetus, can be harmed by exposure to fracking chemicals. There are harms from the incredible noise that's emitted by wellheads and flares and massive trucking input. It's now realized that there's a lot of radioactive material that's dredged up from deep underground. And in fact, this is consistently underestimated by industry and kept secret, more or less. And of course, there's the big thing, climate change. Climate change is influenced by fracking and LNG, and the manifold impacts of that on human and environmental health are obvious. Finally, of course, all of this makes a great number of people very anxious, especially young people who are looking to the future and what their lives are going to be like. And eco-anxiety, of course, is that kind of concern. And solastalgia may not be a familiar term for all of you. Basically, it's a term devised by an Australian philosopher, and it means you feel homesick when you're still at home because so many harms and so much damage has been done to your home area that it no longer feels like you have what you used to have when you were living there or in years before. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the global impacts of greenhouse gases, of which methane is about 85 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide in the first 20 years. And that's the relative interval. Now, some of you may have seen this. The highest temperature ever recorded in the last 140 years since detailed measurements of planetary temperature being taken occurred 2 days ago in this small community of a couple of thousand people in northern Siberia. 38 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit is a very high temperature in most parts of the world, but it was astonishing to see it in northern Siberia. So changes are coming at us from all sides. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a go round here and sort of, you'll see some yellow highlighting. That's the human effects, but higher global temperatures, especially in the polar regions, are starting to thaw permafrost. They're also extending the ranges of disease-carrying insects. This is causing a release of stored methane and CO2, which increases ocean acidification and disrupts fish stocks, which we rely on. We do overfish, but we do still fish. This contributes to accelerated global heating. I think it's better to call it heating because it's not just warming, it's really getting hot. Then you get more wildfires and floods, which displace communities on land. You get to disruption of ecosystems, and one of the other human effects is increased heat stroke. As the sea ice melts, sea levels rise, coastal communities drown, and it's happening already. And meanwhile, we're just producing more greenhouse gas all the time. And that leads to the circle being complete, and then you repeat endlessly. So that's sort of what's going on in the climate change side, the global side of the harms of fracking, which is LNG. I'm going to talk now a little bit about local harms from air pollution. Peter showed some flaring stacks. These are flaring stacks burning off sour gas, which happens widespread in northeastern BC. And if you're not aware of it, this next slide may surprise you. These are the number of wells in 2013, not today, but 7 years ago. It's estimated that about 6,000 more wells will be developed in this region, which is the epicenter of fracking in British Columbia. And we called it, in a tour that we had of residents from this area and officials and physicians, we call it the sacrifice zone, because this is where the harms are being done to human health. One of the outcomes of global temperature increases is increased fires, and they are more extensive, and they're hotter, and they produce smoke, and they have effects on humans. For one thing, they displace normal community controls, leading to breakdown in social values and communication. They displace humans from their homes. They cause day to be turned into night, which can be a very disturbing experience, as well as causing physical harm to people's breathing. And the effects of the mental distress can linger on for sometimes years afterwards. But I want to end with a little note about the fact that not all health problems are either chronic or simply upsetting. Some of them are lethal. And I'm going to give you two examples. Glioblastoma is the most malignant brain tumor that we know of. 1 in 4 patients is still alive after 2 years. In Dawson Creek Hospital, in the epicenter of the sacrifice zone, 13 glioblastomas have been diagnosed in a couple of years, which is about 3 times the expected incidence. And even though the normal age for this is between 45 and 55, there's one patient as young as 28 years old. The second condition that is now increased in the northeastern part of BC is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, basically scarring of the lungs. The lungs get so scarred you can't breathe, and the survival with this condition is never much more than 4 years, average 2.5 to 3.5. Again, in the Dawson Creek Hospital, 10 cases have presented in 2 years, which is over 3 times the expected incidence, and includes people in their 30s. Normally, it's a disease that affects people from 45 to 75. By the way, this data was supplied to me by Ulrike Meyer, who is a Dawson Creek family physician and an incredibly hardworking and valuable researcher on the harms of fracking. Bottom lines, fracking causes substantive health harms for humans, both globally and locally. It's actually, in our opinion, reckless to go ahead with expanding fracking and LNG development. And we've called for a moratorium, that's the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and for action to mitigate past and current harms to human health. So that's what we have been doing. So that's the end of my presentation. And now I would like to introduce the next speaker, which is going to happen shortly.
That's me, Warren.
Yes, I know it's you. I just have to find you, Mark.
Mark.
Oh, sorry, it's Mark. Yes.
Yeah, it's Mark. So we'll go here. So I'm really happy to be introducing Mark because I've known about his work for many years. Mark is an articulate, deeply informed senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which he joined in 1998. And he has become and will be, I'm sure, for a long time, one of Canada's leading progressive commentators on economic and social policy issues. He's also director of the CCPA's Climate Justice Project. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Warren. Yeah, all right. Well, in my brief time, I want to talk about the economics of LNG, a bit of an overview of what's happening in gas markets and where the LNG for Tilbury would be going, and then some of the costs and benefits of developing. As an economist, you want to think about, okay, what are the benefits to British Columbians of pursuing this project, and what are the costs? So let me start with the gas markets right now. Essentially, it's very similar to what's happening in oil markets right now, where we have overproduction. And this is a result of the process of fracking and horizontal drilling that Peter talked about in his presentation. This has been an enormously successful technology at increasing production of hydrocarbons from deep surface deposits. And essentially it's made, you can produce oil and you can produce gas depending on the type of deposit. Fracking has made the United States into the world's #1 oil producer, like by a large margin, larger than Saudi Arabia and Russia. Here in BC, we don't produce a whole lot of oil from the shale. It's mostly gas. And like in other parts of North America, gas production has been up as well. And so the result is that the price of gas has been extremely low. And here in BC, production has basically doubled since 2007. And the vast majority of that production has gone to Alberta, where that gas is used as an input into production of tar sands oil. Even before COVID, this situation of overproduction was taking place. And so if you look at the industry press on the energy sector, none of these companies are making any money. They're all in very dire straits. Some of them call it a shale boom in terms of the levels of debt these companies are holding, that they're going to be hard pressed to repay at current prices. So essentially these companies have kind of written off their original investment to stay afloat. They're trying to just get in as much revenue as they can through volume, and they're cutting costs wherever they can, just on a straight cash flow basis. So forget about repaying the initial investments they made in those drilling rigs. Similar dynamics around gas and commodity prices are happening worldwide as well. So it used to be that gas was constrained geographically to continental markets, like Europe or North America. That still largely is for BC gas, exported to Alberta or to the United States. But liquefied natural gas has allowed the creation of global markets for gas. The result is that there's still, in so many other countries like Australia and Qatar, have been increasing their production levels over the past 5 to 10 years. So LNG is not a particularly profitable commodity to export right now. And for British Columbia, for a particular project looking at developing LNG for export, it's a very expensive process and very energy intensive process to build these liquefaction terminals that chill the gas down into liquid form so that you can put it on a tanker to export. And right now, like the prices prevailing in Asia mean that it's essentially not profitable. You can't justify the upfront investment of all of those costs based on the price in Asia. So a lot of the hype around LNG goes back to like 2012, 2013. It was part of Christy Clark's re-election campaign in that year. And it was all predicated on these really high prices in Asia. So we would sell cheap BC gas at super high prices. Companies would make money, governments make money, there'd be all of these jobs. And all of that was, in hindsight, bullshit. And we called it that at the time. That arbitrage opportunity disappeared very quickly after a few years. And again, right now it doesn't really exist. The one main project that is going ahead, LNG Canada up in Kitimat, however, I think will continue to go ahead because this is LNG Canada is basically Shell is the main oil company, oil and gas company, and then the governments of China, Korea, Malaysia, and so forth. So essentially you have like Asian governments that are the buyers of this gasoline. And for a country like China looking to lock down energy supply for many decades into the future, it's a good bet to go ahead with something like LNG. At least part of the reason why it's good for them to go ahead with LNG is because we are subsidizing it. British Columbians are subsidizing the fracking process and the LNG terminals themselves. And when you think of subsidies, it's not exactly like governments writing a check and just handing it over to the company. A lot of it is foregoing the revenues that we should be getting. So, for example, royalties are the return that the public gets for the development and exploitation of the public resource, which is the gas below the ground. But what the government has done is, first of all, the royalty regime is such that when prices are low, we don't get very much in terms of royalties straight off the bat. And then in addition to that, the government has issued a whole bunch of credits associated with fracking, like deep well credits, they're called. So these are basically they can write off their expenditures against those royalties. And the upshot is that we get extremely little royalties coming into the crown. LNG is another area where the government has kind of bent over backwards to provide subsidies, even more so than the previous Liberal government. So we're subsidizing the electricity that the companies will be drawing on from BC Hydro. We're giving them a discount on the carbon tax, and we're giving them lower corporate income tax rates than other companies would be paying. So in a sense, we're not going to get a whole lot back. The idea that we're going to get billions and billions that we can invest in schools and roads and hospitals is not going to happen. The other main area that you might think of as a benefit for British Columbia would be jobs. And that's been a lot of the rhetoric around this, is that it's going to create so many jobs. And certainly in the construction phase, as you're building an LNG terminal or building a pipeline, there are thousands of jobs associated with that. But once it's actually built, very few. So the Tilbury plant in the filings that Fortis made says that it'll create 110 permanent jobs, probably a little less than that realistically. Even the industry writ large, the gas industry upstream is really about 4,000 jobs. So it's not particularly huge in terms of the total number of jobs. So again, these are the main benefits you get from LNG, revenues and jobs. Both of those are very, very weak. And then you have to weigh that against the costs. And some of those have been covered already and are coming up, but climate, air pollution, land disturbance, impacts on water, impacts on human health. These all have huge costs that have to be accounted for, and that's ultimately the calculus we need to make in terms of like whether this makes sense in economic terms. That's it from me. I'm going to introduce Owen Finn, who'll be speaking about safety issues. Owen's a management consultant with 35 years of business experience, a retired partner of the accounting and consulting firm KPMG. Owen has spent the last 6 years researching the global LNG industry as the research director of My Sea to Sky. Take it away, Owen.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, the proponents of LNG facilities would have you believe that LNG is just a harmless product, which when it released vaporizes, floats up in the air and disappears. I have done lots of research and beg to differ on that description. Tilbury, the facility as it stands, accomplished a phase 1 expansion in 2018 to add the tank you see on the right, 34,000 tons of it, to the original tank on the left, which was half that size and had a secondary containment moat around it. The proposal one is to phase out the original tank, add the phase 1 tank, and in phase 2, the 120,000 ton tank is huge. It's a storage tank for the LNG produced in the compression area over here. Notice that there would be the Westpac jetty next door, and of course a rather large flare. The expansion history is down on the bottom right. You see that the original one could produce 60 tons a day. Phase 1, 760 tons a day, and the phase 2 that's now being proposed would go all the way up to 13,700 tons per day, about 5 million tons a year, and would increase the storage to about 150,000 tons of supercooled fracked gas. The tankers coming to take it away could be as long as 300 meters. They're bigger than an apartment. This is a 4-story one in Boston. Each of the tankers would have about 65,000 tons of flammable gas aboard. Boston has a rigid security technique for dealing with the arrivals of these things, and it costs about $80,000 to the city of Boston every time one comes up the street. The Society of International Gas Tanker and Terminal Operators, SIGTO, which is the LNG Industry Association. Pretty well every LNG plant belongs to them, to this organization, but neither Fortis nor Westpac do. Suggest strongly that LNG plants should not locate in narrow inland waterways with significant commercial, recreational, and ferry traffic. That's rather an apt description of the Lower Fraser. Add in some airplanes, seaplanes to the whole mix, and you have a recipe for disaster. US regulations after 9/11 recognized that an LNG tanker spill would be lethal to a nearby population. Key spills over water are different than spills over land because the water acts as a vapor provider to the LNG, the regasified LNG. It acts as a white vapor cloud, can drift a fair distance before it ignites any ignition source. When the US Department studied this, they asked, of course, how far would this go? And the answer was about up to 3.5 kilometers at worst case. So the US instituted some rules saying that you should not locate LNG facilities within 3.5 kilometers of an LNG plant of a significant population. And because if that ignites, it'll be more of a fireball than an explosion, and there are severe impacts. Plotting those hazard areas, the first one being up to plus or minus 500 meters from the path of an LNG facility or an LNG tanker, which I call the popsicle zone, because anybody within that suffering a spill would become a human popsicle. Zone 2, as you can see in the map, covers heavily populated parts of Richmond, Steveston, and some of Delta. Is a severe burn area where the ignition of the gas would cause the people in the way to be severely burned. And out to 3,500 meters, which is the dotted line, covering larger parts of both of those, would suffer severe burns. LNG tankers in Boston Harbor get tight security. As I said, it costs 80 grand for every time one of these things comes into Boston to make sure that nothing evil happens. Turning the LNG tankers and barges, if it comes upstream nose first, it has to go downstream nose first. But turning a 300-meter tanker at Tilbury, at the proposed jetty, would be a significant problem. Because what they're proposing is that you basically tie the back end of the tanker to the pier and let the current going out to pass the Massey Tunnel out to the ocean, turn the nose around with the aid of some very big tugs. That's a risky proposition. It would involve closing the very busy Fraser River for an extended period while you perform this maneuver. Any mistake and you fetch up on the opposite shore where a jet fuel terminal is being constructed. Tilbury also is subject hugely to liquefaction in the event of a significant seismic event. It's the worst place in all of BC and the Lower Mainland. This is a map produced by the GVRD saying what the liquefaction hazard is for that area. Tilbury's right in the middle of it. Earthquake-prone Japan requires LNG storage tanks to be put underground so that in the event of a crack or somebody taking a pot shot at it, the LNG can't really go anywhere. But contrary to that advice, on the worst liquefaction area in the whole of BC, they built a very large overground tank at Tilbury. The conclusions would be that the Lower Fraser is a very unsafe location to build a large-scale LNG plant, and BC and Canadian regulations have to do a lot of catch-up to meet international standards and best practices. So that's about it. It's not a safe place. Now I'd like to introduce Anna Barford. Anna is the Canadian shipping campaigner for Stand.Earth. She's born in BC. She started her career as an environmental engineer and is inspired by the idea that Canada and BC in particular would become a shining example of how to do things right in the world. She's worked on campaigns for Dogwood, Georgia Strait Alliance, and now Stand.Earth. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Owen. All right, my turn to share screens. So, as Owen introduced, I'm the Canada Shipping Campaigner with Stand.Earth, and I'll be chatting about LNG as a green fuel. We had a report done by the International Council on Clean Transportation, specifically with this question, and so we'll be sharing the results from that. So just sort of as a beginning point, where did this all start? And we go back to April 2018 when the International Maritime Organization kind of joins the fight and declares that they will reduce their greenhouse gases and takes on a strategy to do so. And this is moderately great news. International shipping had been left out of the Paris Agreement, despite the huge climate impacts that it has. So this will be pretty key to slowing climate change. The IMO goals are to reduce the intensity of their fleet by 40% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. Now, these are insufficient, but for the moment, we will accept them as our targets. So on the right of my slide, you can see that just over a year later, Carnival Corporation joins in, which is pretty interesting for our story here. They are the largest cruise company.
Anna, sorry to interrupt. I think you're sharing the wrong screen. You're sharing your notes screen and not your presentation screen.
Oh, that's interesting. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Well, my notes were pretty good anyways. You all haven't missed much. So where were we? Carnival Corporation joins in. And this is pretty interesting. So this is the largest cruise company in the world. So their brands include Princess, Holland America, and many more. And they are the biggest fee payer in the cruise industry groups. So that gets them very well represented at the IMO policy meetings. So they put out this press release saying how wonderful things were, and they were going to be decarbonizing, and they'll be joining this coalition to getting to zero. So we dug down a bit, and on the bottom of my screen, you can see their plan included LNG. So it turns out that their decarbonization press release had a lot of carbon in it, and we wanted to find out kind of precisely how much. So we got together with ICCT and asked about this report where we wanted to compare the life cycle greenhouse gases, LNG, marine gas oil, very low sulfur fuel oil, and heavy fuel oil, or we may remember it also as bunker oil, in engines used internationally, including those with cruise ships. And LNG's main component is methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas, is very well established on this webinar. And methane is sort of a little bit different. Methane is most active in the atmosphere for a shorter time frame than many other greenhouse gases. So it's closer to 12 years that it's up there. And so looking at a 100-year timescale, which is what a lot of industry projections had done, is pretty misleading, and it dilutes a lot of the impacts. So we really wanted to focus on the 20-year greenhouse warming potential. Also because it's more relevant to what we need to do to reduce our greenhouse gas impacts immediately. So this is the kind of big results image. This is the equivalent CO2, so the global warming potential for 3 different engines. The most commonly used one is on the right over here with this big orange bar. And this on the left of each engine type is LNG as compared to other fuel types. And it's pretty clear, it's very damning. Switching to LNG is not better for the climate. In fact, sticking to heavy fuel oil, which is bottom of the barrel, kind of last thing to come out of the refinery, essentially a waste product, that's better for the climate than moving to LNG. And it's worth noting that we were constrained to what is available in literature. So emissions from fracking are underestimated. And fracking is, depending on your screen, is looking at either blue or green, sort of in that middle bar. The brown on the bottom is combustion, emissions from combustion. So that's actually burning of the LNG. And it's worth noting that the reduction in intensity of those CO2 equivalents does not meet the IMO targets, even though they were insufficient. This switch doesn't get us to there. So if we switched over the whole fleet, this is insufficient. And then we look at the emissions from fracking, and then we look at methane slip. So LNG engines are quite leaky, it turns out. And when that leak happens, it's methane, which is very potent. So our most popular LNG engine technology emits 70% more life cycle greenhouse gases when used LNG instead of marine gas oil, and 82% more than using marine gas oil in a comparable medium speed diesel engine. So this is not reaching our targets. If we could fix all the other leaks and inefficiency, this fuel doesn't meet the IMO targets in the long term. Some other things to add in are just that methane slip increases at lower engine loads. So if the ship is traveling more slowly, doing some of those navigational things that Owen was talking about, or if it's a little emptier, there's more slip. So investing in LNG infrastructure makes it more difficult to transition away later and more expensive as well. In terms of alternatives, we're looking at wind assistance, and the IMO is working a lot with increasing efficiency of vessels, working with the propeller and the hull design. And of course, there's renewables coming online, hybrid and battery technologies are getting better and better so that we can get to zero emission and fuel cells. So that's enough for me. Next, I'd like to introduce Tracy Saxby, who will be speaking about LNG and climate change. Tracy is a marine scientist, activist, and visionary change maker. In 2007, she kickstarted the grassroots movement to reduce single-use plastic bags across Canada. She is currently the executive director of My Sea Sky and has been working to stop wood fiber LNG in Howe Sound for the last 6 years.
Thanks, Anna. So I'm going to be speaking about the impacts of LNG on climate change today. So one of the first things to note is that we are facing a climate emergency. Whether it's wildfires, floods, sea level rise, severe storms, Canadians are already experiencing the impacts of climate change right here, and it's costing us billions of dollars every year. We have 10 years left to radically transform our society and to reduce emissions immediately. That's what the IPCC has told us, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have to take action and ensure that we keep our temperature to 1.5 degree increase if we want to have a livable planet. So how are we doing with that? Well, right now, BC is not on track to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction targets. And if we look at how BC is doing, I'll share some fun facts here. So from 2007 to 2017, we've only reduced emissions by about 0.5%. From 2015 to 2017, emissions have been increasing by about 2.4%. And in 2018, which isn't even on this graph, we just found out that BC's emissions increased by another 3 megatons of carbon pollution. So what we're doing isn't working. And in fact, we're moving in the wrong direction. To achieve BC's current climate targets, which is 40% below 2007 levels by 2030, we have a lot of work to do. We need to reduce emissions by more than 5% every single year. And if we want to achieve the IPCC targets, which are even stronger, which is a 45% reduction below 2010 levels by 2030, and then net zero by 2050, we've got even more work to do. And so let's think about that for a second, because right now in COVID, we've shut down the entire world's economy, and scientists are estimating that we've only reduced emissions by 5%. So how are we going to achieve this goal if we keep on building new fossil fuel infrastructure? So let's talk about FortisBC's Tilbury LNG and what they're going to be producing. So looking at just the local emissions, and these are the emissions that are produced right in Delta, this one project is going to be creating over 200,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year for this one project. So Fortis is estimating right now that they're going to start construction and then operations will begin in 2028. And they're estimating, or they're projecting, that they're going to be operational for 40 years. So let's do the math on that for a second. Okay, so 40 years, that means that FortisBC, the Tilbury LNG, will still be operational in 2068. So let's look at this graph again. We need to be at net zero by 2050. That's what the scientists are telling us. And yet FortisBC is going to be producing now over 200,000 megatons of carbon pollution every single year until 2068. Something isn't adding up here. So some of the things that you're going to hear from Fortis is that natural gas is the cleanest burning fossil fuel. And that's true, it is, but it's not the big picture or the entire picture, because what this statement is doing is it's only comparing the final point of combustion. It's ignoring the entire life cycle emissions. So all of the fugitive methane from fracking, all of the fugitive methane that happens at every step of the way, all of the shipping emissions when they're shipping this product to China or to Asia or to Europe or wherever they're going to be shipping it to. And then the final point of combustion when they finally regasify their LNG so that it can be used at the other end or by the final consumer. So this statement, all it's doing is comparing that point of final combustion. It's not looking at the entire life cycle of LNG or looking at all of the fugitive emissions all the way along. And even if it was, it's still a fossil fuel. Another thing you'll hear Fortis say is BC LNG is a climate solution. So spoiler alert, it's not. So according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that report from 2018 said that natural gas can only increase production if it is coupled with carbon capture and storage. So what is FortisBC planning to ensure that BC and Canada achieves net zero by 2050? How is it going to increase production of LNG and increase fracking with all of the emissions associated with that when it's not planning for carbon capture and storage? The International Energy Agency in 2019 in their report, they note in their report that natural gas is still a fossil fuel and it remains a source of emissions. That unabated consumption of fossil fuels is not a long-term solution to climate change. That new gas infrastructure will lock in emissions for the future. That natural gas is in direct competition with renewables. That renewable energy is cheaper to install. So why are we even going down this pathway? And that, again, deployment of carbon capture and storage will be crucial if we want to achieve our climate targets. There's another article that was published in Nature, which is one of the most prestigious scientific journal articles, that states that existing oil and gas infrastructure jeopardizes the 1.5 degree target that I talked about. So what this means is that we cannot develop new fossil fuel infrastructure. And the authors say this themselves in their report. They say little to no new carbon emitting infrastructure can be commissioned, and that existing infrastructure may need to be retired early or retrofitted with carbon capture and storage technology in order to meet the Paris Agreement climate targets or the climate goals. So why is Fortis willing to invest in this? We think that they're not thinking clearly about this because it doesn't make sense unless they can start using carbon capture and storage to make sure that all of the emissions are net zero by 2050. The other thing you will hear Fortis say is that BC LNG will reduce emissions in China. So this is a different scientific journal article, and I'm going to quote directly from the authors. Exporting LNG is likely to increase global greenhouse gas emissions. While uncertainty remains, methane leakage, additional energy demand, and decreased domestic coal displacement have the very real potential to undermine any prospective climate benefit in the long term. So what the authors are saying is that there's a very little likelihood that LNG will displace coal. There's no guarantee of that. And many, many other authors have also highlighted that issue. Now, something else that the authors say is that future LNG export facilities could become today's coal plants, where entrenched interests fight meaningful action to reduce climate emissions with significant negative impacts on the global public. This is already happening. We're already seeing FortisBC doing this. They're already fighting to stop municipalities from saying no to natural gas in new buildings. They have a product to sell. They want to continue selling frack gas, and they have no intention of stopping anytime soon. So we're already seeing these entrenched interests fighting the actions that we need to take to reduce climate change and the impacts of climate change. And finally, BC LNG is the cleanest LNG in the world. So that statement completely ignores emissions from fracking. They're focusing solely on the fact that they are trying to power their LNG facilities using electricity, which makes them clean, and I would swear, but I'm not allowed to. So a few things about this. Methane emissions from fossil fuel extraction is 25 to 40% higher than previously estimated. Another scientific journal article states that 1/3 of the increase in methane emissions since 2009 is due to fracking in North America. And British Columbia is underreporting the fugitive emissions from fracking. So we have a big problem here. LNG is very clearly not clean. And just to wrap up, we cannot develop new fossil fuel infrastructure in a climate emergency. It's that simple. So I'd like to introduce Laura Baird, who will be speaking about the impacts of Tilbury LNG on First Nations rights and title. She will also be sharing the impacts of Tilbury LNG on salmon and the fragile ecosystems of the Fraser River. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And I must say thank you for keeping us organized tonight, especially me. It's good to have that organization. It was very much appreciated. So welcome, everybody. I thank you for joining us here tonight. We've heard some very technical and scientific explanations for LNG, and also a perspective as to what our lower or Fraser River is going to look like, or potentially could look like in the next number of years. So as an Indigenous person, I want to give more of a grassroots perspective how this may affect First Nations up and down the Fraser River, and that means from the mouth of the Fraser all the way down, and it's significant to think of what those impacts might look like. So I remain supportive of the continued efforts being made to protect Mother Earth and our traditional medicines. In our community, as a TFM member, I see us as a nation moving forward to protect our lands in earnest. We've had consultation with major projects, but however, it's a timely process, and often as a member, I feel I'm lost to know exactly how our traditional lands and resources will be impacted by these proposed projects in TFN territory, especially when they are environmentally challenged. The process of consultation is also very mystifying, and I can tell you it changes from project to project. And as per the treaty and as per Indigenous rights, we have that right to be consulted. We have members who have limited access to presentations. We do get a phone call that there will be a presentation by Fortis or some of the other major projects in our community, and it's pretty hard to pull everybody together on short notice and say, okay, here are the impacts of this for your community and your traditional hunting and gathering grounds. And again, some of the technical and scientific explanations that we heard tonight aren't always articulated in the fashion that many of our community members could potentially understand. So when all is said and done, and we present our concerns back to our community leaders and to others, when our community leaders bring those concerns forward, they're minimized somewhat and downplayed. And it's my opinion that when the consultation is finished, it's exactly that. The governments say consultation has occurred. So the Tilbury projects and others from the mouth of the Fraser upwards and back again are concerning because, and these are just some of the questions and some of the concerns that have come from members of our community. And again, it's a grassroots response based solely on what happens in our community as far as sustaining our community. So there's the potential for increased river traffic, which interrupts the Fraser ecosystem, causing environmental concerns related to noise and pollution. It further jeopardizes the Pacific salmon and killer whale populations. And also it interrupts or causes significant stress on the salmon during their en route status to the spawning grounds upriver. The discharge and potential for increased water temperature is also important in recognizing that it increases the salmon mortality rates. And as we heard earlier, there are significant safety concerns of both the site and the tankers. I have to leave you with a small thought on that particular one. And as it was explained, how the tankers would be turned around at the jetty. To think of a 32-foot gill netter, if we ever do make it back to the river, with one of those tankers beside it, if they will even be allowed in the river at the same time. So the river, the foreshore, and the ocean remains the traditional gathering grounds of my husband's people. And we recognize the need to quickly assume our stewardship role to protect whatever we can to ensure a future for our children. However, it is futile at best to assume these efforts when these types of projects continue to look beyond the protection of the natural resources and instead favoring money and profits, and all in an effort to send this particular item overseas. So we are concerned, and I know Tsawwassen First Nation is working on providing a response for July 16, and I'm grateful for that, and I do believe we'll have further time to consult with Fortis. I just hope that Fortis is open to hear our concerns and exactly the status of the Pacific salmon and how there will be no fish in the river this year. And we're waiting for the return. And in order for that return to happen, we have to clean up the river, take care of the future, and ensure that these projects don't occur in this particular area. So I thank you. Thank you all for listening to me. And it's my job now to introduce our next speaker. Now, our next speaker is also our moderator for the Q&A session. Her name is Nikki Sharma, and I believe that our Q&A will start next. So Nikki is a lawyer and a senior oil and gas campaigner at Stand Earth. Nikki will be moderating the Q&A session today. So welcome, Nikki, please. Thank you, guys.
Oh, Nick, you're just on mute.
You're right, I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. So my job is to take the questions you've been asking and put them to the panelists. So if people don't know where to write the questions, you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and please keep them coming and I will pose them to the panelists for you. So I'm going to start with a question to Mark, which is a question about money. There's a couple of the people in the audience that are asking about where the profits and the money are going for the LNG, if they're not going into the royalties and they're not going into as many jobs. So have you done analysis of that, Mark?
Actually, I think Mark might have had to leave.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Yeah, he had to leave at 6:30. So
Sorry, I didn't know that. Okay, so does anybody else want to answer that question?
Could you repeat the question, please, Nikki?
Sure. There was a question from the audience about where the money is going. So who's benefiting from the current money to be made on LNG if it's not going to the government and in payments for royalty? I believe that was the question.
Well, the fracking companies, clearly. There are a whole bunch of them. They're doing poorly at the moment because, as Mark explained, the price of LNG in Asia is about a little over $100 a ton, and according to the industry itself, it's going to take $800 a ton to make it and ship it to Asia. So nobody's making any money is the bottom line. And the people who are over at Victoria lobbying the government for further subsidies paid by all taxpayers are the fracking companies and the LNG firms. Now, Fortis is in a unique position. It's a regulated utility, and it has already announced that it's going to go to the BC Utilities Commission in the fall to seek permission to unload some of their costs for doing this on their million or so customers. And by basically adding to the rates they charge their customers for the service of supplying the gas for heating our homes and cooking our food. They will be going there and hoping that they can get BCUC to allow them to defray the expenses of this onto the public dime. That's not what's supposed to happen, but again, the Fortis is a regulated utility who was guaranteed an 8.5% return on its capital investments. And you and I would love to have the ability to walk into a bank, plunk down our $10 and get 8.5% interest on it when the government is paying 1/10 of that by way of long-term interest rates at the moment. So there is a second arm to this, which is the BC Utilities Commission hearings in the fall, where Fortis will try its luck on getting you and me to pay for it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. A question to Laura. I wonder if you could tell the audience a little bit about how we can support your efforts and the Tsawwassen First Nations efforts to be part of this process and protect their rights and title and their interests that you expressed.
Thank you, Nikki. I do believe that Tsawwassen First Nation does have legal working on this particular project, as well as, it's called the Tilbury projects. There's 3 different areas, the LNG site, the jetty, and there's also another project as well. Tsawwassen is well aware, and they do bring all of this to community consultation. However, it is important to remind all the First Nations that these type of projects do impact everyone's traditional territory. It's not just Tsawwassen First Nation. So encourage, supporting Tsawwassen and what they're doing, and also looking downriver and thinking of the Musqueam people, the Kwantlen people, as well as the Semiahmoo. So we just continue to support each other and look forward to your moral support as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. There's a couple questions that have to do with the impacts of climate change. So the payment for the sea level rise and how that might impact, and who's going to pay for the climate adaptation measures that may be needed to prevent any major damage on the site itself. Tracy, did you want to take that question?
Yeah, so, and I can't speak specifically to how much Delta is going to have to pay to adapt to climate change, but I do know that it's been estimated that the cost of that is in the billions every year, because climate change is already costing Canadian billions of dollars every year, and that's just responding to extreme storms and severe weather that we're seeing. So for example, 2018 and 2017, just to pay for British Columbia's response to wildfires or the suppression of wildfires was over $600 million for both of those years. So we're already paying, and our communities are already paying the cost of climate change. Canadians are already paying the cost of climate change, and it is in the billions every year. As for who should pay for this, there are some campaigns out there that are calling for climate accountability, to ask for the fossil fuel companies to start paying their fair share of the costs. Because right now it's the municipalities that are paying for this, it's the taxpayers that are paying for this, it's ourselves that are paying for this. My basement flooded due to climate change this year. It's going to cost me tens of thousands of dollars. I am paying for climate change, the irony of that. So yeah, it's a very good question about who should be paying for the cost of this pollution.
Okay, thank you. There was a question that was already answered in the questions answers about the Port of Vancouver and its role in, similar to what Anna was talking about. And I wonder if you want to just, to everybody that maybe not have read what you put, just answer that question about how the port is trying to say that LNG is their solution to addressing climate change, and what the role of your campaign and what you're working on to counter that.
Yeah, so the port thinks that LNG is a great solution and is ready to provide credits as part of their Eco Action program to reduce port fees for any ships that are coming in under LNG power. I checked, they haven't received any yet, so it's not well tested as to how many credits or what sort of dollar value it would be for them. And anything that sort of can be done, what we'll be doing is approaching the port with this report, as well as the federal decision makers, just to say, hey, look, this is not a good option, even when we look at just the combustion costs, but precisely, especially when we look at methane slip, at the leakage, and as well at upstream emissions from fracking. So you can head on over to stand.earth and sign up to get involved, or I'm emailing around the report as well, so you can just hit me up in the chat and I'll send you a copy.
All right, thanks, Anna. Next question to Peter. There's a couple questions on here about political strategies in terms of the current provincial government we have, and the role that they might play in improving or expanding projects like this. And I wonder, Peter, if you can comment on your thoughts about the political aspect of this and the strategy involved with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have minority government here in British Columbia, obviously an NDP government supported by the Greens. The Greens have taken a pretty strong stand on fracking and LNG, but unfortunately have, this isn't an issue that they've decided to bring the government down on. And so, I think the political will to do these things comes from, the movement of people that are working to stop them. And it's bit by bit. I think, the case against the Tilbury LNG project in particular is so strong that hopefully we can use this new review process to stop it. But when we look at sort of the movement in general, it's going to be a long time fighting. And, the Wilderness Committee has been working to protect old growth forests for 40 years. We have had a lot of victories in that time, but we're still doing it. And so I think the fight against fracking and LNG, we got to dig in for the long term. And unfortunately, it's time we don't have. But the more people pay attention to climate change and understand that we just can't go down this path, then the more our governments will be forced to listen.
Okay, does anybody else want to jump in that conversation before I ask the next question that's on the panel? No? Okay. So a question for Dr. Bell. You talked very specifically about the work, and that you named a particular doctor that was doing the kind of frontline work, it looks like, about the impact of that. Is there any support or resources that helps maybe quantify the direct health impacts in a way that would help to kind of expose it? Or is these are kind of people are operating on their own, like the doctor you mentioned?
A lot has changed in the last year. Larry Barzilai and Larry is the kind of coordinator for CAPE in British Columbia. And I went to Northeastern BC 2 years ago. And then last year we brought down a number of individuals who are central to the business of fracking and responding to the business of fracking in Northeastern BC. They included Ulrike herself, included Karen Levin, who is an environmental consultant. We included farmers, we included renewable energy experts, and we included a number of really eloquent First Nations spokespeople. There's actually a lot of activity going on, and it's accelerating as time goes by. A researcher from Montreal, Élise Caron-Baudouin, has come and done a couple of projects. One completed that showed that benzene, a well-known carcinogen, is found in the cord blood of mothers who have given birth, meaning their babies have been receiving a carcinogen through blood and the placenta. There are other research projects now going ahead. Elise is coming back to do some further stuff on air quality. There really is starting to be, I think what Peter was mentioning, that just when things start to become public, then people start to react to them. We had a conversation with Bruce Ralston, who is the Minister of Energy, Mines, and something else, fossil fuel, but I don't think they call it that, petroleum resources. And Ulrike was in on the call, and to be honest, the only person he was interested in talking to was Ulrike, because she presented the statistics that I reviewed for you this evening on glioblastoma and pulmonary fibrosis, which are pretty devastating. These are fatal illnesses that are tripled in frequency in the epicenter of fracking, which we call the sacrifice zone. If a minister of the Crown gets interested, and in fact he said, I'd like to have a further conversation specifically with Ulrike. So if this sort of conversation, these kind of conversations are taking place, it means that the government is starting to pay attention, to realize it just can't go on willy-nilly and proceed with these extravagantly gigantic projects, because it's the government that's making it happen. Fortis will leap at every opportunity, but the government has to open the door. And the government will have to respond as time goes by. They're piling up obstacles as they go. Health is a big one. First Nations title and right, obviously Laura has much more to say about that, and much more knowledge. I just think the noose, I like to say the noose is tightening around the neck of the blind and deaf to future considerations, and it's going to be harder and harder for them to proceed.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple questions that I see, or at least one that talks about how the people that are listening can participate in the public process. Owen, did you want to talk a little bit about that, or somebody wants to jump in to give people an opportunity to say how they can participate?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. The only immediate avenue for participating in the process for the public is the public comment period, which is open until July 16th, end of day. The two open houses that this presentation today is after were held yesterday and last Thursday, and they're over. So there's no further public communication by the proponent required, or by the Environmental Assessment Office in this regard. So you're expected to read the project description that's been put up on the BC Environmental Assessment Office EPIC website. You can Google it and get to the Fortis proposal. You're expected to read all that and then respond. So the reason why we put on today's session was to give you some things to think about when you do respond. We're hoping that as many people as possible do respond. You can do it as simply as saying, I don't think this is a good idea, so I really think you should deny it. We're hoping to get a massive response, particularly from the people in the areas of Richmond and Delta, to that. July 16th, BC Environmental Assessment Office, and I think we will post a link to the website where you can put in your comment either anonymously or in your full name as part of this. So please, all those who are 100 of us who are on this call, please provide a comment, and it can be as pithy as I don't want it to more elaborate if you know the details and have listened very carefully to what we've been saying. Thank you.
Tracy, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Owen. I'd also like to add, I mean, for the last 6 years, what My Sea to Sky has done is we've tried to make it as simple as possible for people to engage in the process. And I want to acknowledge right now that this is a very broken process. They don't really want you to engage. And that you can see that because of the way that they've been holding these open houses. The other thing I want to highlight is this is a very new process. So we right now are trying to learn ourselves how it's going to differ from what we've experienced with wood fiber LNG. And this is a new process, a new substituted process, and it's that the time period that we're in right now is not something that we've actually had to participate in before. So we're still figuring this all out. My Sea to Sky will likely be putting up information on a page with, like, we're going to highlight our key concerns and some of the key issues that we have so that people can copy and paste and then put them in. But recognize that it is more valuable if you can take the time to review and to provide comments separately rather than just copying and pasting. But we do that. And Peter, did you want to speak as well to what Wilderness Committee is doing right now?
You're on mute.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just had to tell my coworkers in the back to be quiet. Yeah, the Wilderness Committee is, we currently have a letter writing tool that allows you to send a fax into the BCEAO process. And so if you want to go to our website, wildernesscommittee.org, we can, it makes it easy for you. We kind of had to find a way that we could do it. And besides that, you know, we'll be organizing against the Tilbury Island proposal as it goes forward through the BCAO process, and putting pressure on Mr. Heyman to reject it at his first opportunity and not his second one.
All right, thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Okay, there is a question about the move, and particularly in the city of Vancouver, to end the use of natural gas in houses through the building changes in building codes. And I guess the question would be, how do we engage in that kind of discussion or throw that into the discussion that we're having about expansion of LNG and the storage supply unit that they're saying is necessary?
I'll add a bit to that discussion. Fortis has 1 million customers between Lower Mainland mainly and Vancouver Island. And they know that if such amendments to municipal zoning policies come in that restrict new buildings from having gas-powered heating and cooking facilities, that their goose is cooked, literally. And they're fighting hard to find alternate markets, particularly as Anna has explained, LNG-powered vessels and export market for the gas that they're committed to buying. Various municipalities, Vancouver particularly, are starting to restrict the use of gas-powered heating and ventilation and cooking facilities in particularly multi-unit buildings. And so Fortis is trying madly to diversify before the inevitable happens and they have no 1 million plus customers. And that's what's driving them here to this kind of lunacy, hopefully in their view, at public expense. Tracy, I saw you wanting to add to that. Thanks.
Oh, no, I was just nodding along in agreement. Yes, Fortis has fracked gas that they want to sell because all of the communities across Canada are going to be moving to zero emissions as soon as possible. They're not going to have customers soon. So they're trying to figure out a way to sell their frack gas overseas and to sell it to LNG for LNG shipping. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, Anna, if you could maybe jump into the conversation from the other end, because we know a component of this project is about the bunkering facility. and the work that you're doing to help people see that that's not a climate solution. How far or how broad do you think this market is that they're talking about, and how do you effectively get them to change the dialogue on that?
Yeah, so the market, according even to the Port of Vancouver, is pretty infinitesimal relative to the size of the Tilbury expansion. The Port of Vancouver put out a report in 2017 where the demand they were expected over sort of, the course of 2040 even, that first of all, it wouldn't start until 2030, 2035. We wouldn't be seeing demand for LNG in the 2020s. And that as demand grew, we'd be at less than a megaton. And I believe Tilbury is at 5. So we're at 1/5 of that facilities. And so they'd obviously need to export it to let it go, to find customers. So one thing that we're doing is highlighting on the corporate level to look at the demand side for these, to advocate at the IMO, and also to put pressure on companies to say, hey, this is not meeting your climate goals, and we know it. And so we're going directly to those corporations to say, we call your bluff. This is not right, and we have the science to prove it. This is not a climate solution.
Yeah. All right. A question for Laura. You talked a lot about in your opening, in your remarks, about the cumulative impacts on salmon and orcas, and all the things that are already impacting your territory. I'm just wondering how you plan on including that in the discussion, and if there is something that is collective that we can do to help support that.
Well, just a couple of things to clarify. It's a reminder that I am one member of Tsawwassen First Nation. And years ago, there was an LNG proposed site for Tsawwassen lands. So we did have a vote back then, and we defeated the proposal. And I think one can maybe attest maybe by 2 or 3 votes. So quite often when the proponents come out, it looks like a good deal on paper to many of the First Nations. So when they come and they talk dollars and cents, when it actually breaks right down to it, how does it benefit the individual member, and do the environmental impacts outweigh that? So those are some of the discussions that have come to our communities. So in this particular case, the traditional territory of Tsawwassen people is held by a treaty. And to look at the treaty in one respect is some of the impacts are outside of the lands in the treaty. So to understand, however, the impacts are on a river and its contents and the ecosystem, as well as the estuary that roll through Tsawwassen territory. So I would say that supporting all the local First Nations and encouraging them to stand up and say, hey, enough of this, and this is impacting your traditional territories. I know that there's a First Nation, and I believe it would be Semiahmoo, that has traditional gathering places on the shores of the Fraser River, very near to where that particular center or that plant is proposed, and the jetty where they would have traditional fires and gather. So the best approach I would see as a member is to support the other nations as they gather their information together to provide on the 16th. And many of those nations have done that. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. There's a question about what the reason that Fortis gives for proposing the facilities so close to the jet fuel storage tanks that are right across from South Arm, the LNG facility. Is there a panelist that is familiar and can answer that? If not, I'm sure we could figure out getting the answer to you later on. Anybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fortis argues that they've operated the smaller 60-ton a day plant since 1971 without serious problems. If you, of course, ignore last year's explosion at the plant, and couple of years ago when Bird's Bog caught fire, they had to evacuate the whole plant, leaving the super cooled gas to do what it normally does and vaporize. Anyhow, they say that they will be able to cover their own firefighting requirements at the plant. But the the city of Delta is going to have to provide emergency services, and it lacks currently any fireboat that would fight the fire from the water. And Squamish has learned the cost at its cost, not having a fireboat nearby. The city of Vancouver has, but it's in Falls Creek. It's in the port of Vancouver, and would have to go all the way around to Delta in order to do anything. When an LNG fire happens, it happens pretty quickly. So they don't have that. And the Delta Fire Department, last I looked, does not have the special foam retardant that you need to fight an LNG fire, because if you pour water on LNG, all it does is vaporize and become a worse ignition point. I'm not happy at all that any emergency plan, any real emergency plan exists for fighting a fire at an LNG facility producing 5 million tons a year and storing 150,000 tons of it in 2 big tanks.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming up on our time here for the questions, and I know there are more questions, and I think the group will endeavor to answer those questions after this talk. And there was one that recurred about the presentations being available, so we'll definitely follow up with that. I'm just going to spend the last few minutes going to the panelists and seeing if anybody wants to give, or each one wants to give some closing remarks, and particularly focus on how we can all work together on this. So maybe we'll start just as the videos go across my screen with Tracy.
Okay, yeah, so we will, as My Sea to Sky, we will be making a submission, and we will be sharing that with the general public, and we'll be working in coordination with all of the organizations that are on this call right now, as well as many other organizations that we can bring in. So if you're interested in this project, pay attention to our website, myseatosky.org. And we will be posting stuff. It will likely take us a couple of weeks to get some information up there, just so that we've got some of the key concerns highlighted and what you might want to, or how you might want to participate. So yeah, that's it from us.
Okay, next I see Owen on my screen.
Okay. I addressed the subject of safety, and this is a terrible location to put an LNG facility. Normally you put them away from human populations. You do not put them in the middle of a metro area where tankers have to float by populated areas. Especially in the middle of the best and most prolific salmon river in all of BC, on whom First Nations rely. And we have done very great damage to over the years. So First Nations particularly have a very important voice to play in this, to express in this proposal. And I'm quite sure if the Musqueam and Tsawwassen First Nations particularly say no to this project, it will go away. But we must help and do our piece. The Fortis is in the position of being not just a publicly regulated utility, but also a public company. So anybody here who is a shareholder or knows a shareholder in Fortis, have them express themselves to Mr. Perrin, who is the CEO of Fortis, a Nova Scotia-based company. And to tell him that this is not a good idea, would he please find another way to save his company? Thanks.
All right, thank you. Anna?
Well, LNG is not a climate solution. It's not good for export. It's not good as a marine fuel. We have to stop it from supply side, and from a demand side, we're also there. So Stan's going to be working with Friends of Tilbury in this coalition to coordinate our responses and to get lots of folks involved in that public comment period.
Thank you. Peter, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, for me, it just comes back to all the frac wells I've seen in the northeast of the province, 2,800 more of them. If we can stop these LNG plants, it'll limit the amount of fracking that has to go on. There's very little new fracking for Canadian domestic use. So it has to be both. We have to stop these projects, and we're working on banning fracking in British Columbia as well. It's a bit of a longer term campaign, but I think just to add to my remarks earlier, one of the things people can do beyond participating in the BCEAO is really put pressure on those NDP MPs who know that this is a better, that there are better ways to do this and that this is a problem. You know, I can think about a lot of the NDP MLAs in Metro Vancouver who are privately against fracking and LNG, but would find it hard to come out against it. So really lean on them, and we can get this thing stopped, I think.
All right, thank you, Peter. Laura?
Hi. I just want to raise 3 points from the other end of the supply chain, because that's where this whole disaster begins. It begins up in northeastern BC, where the epicenter of production is, primary production. First of all, I'm sure most of the speakers know this, but maybe not all the listeners do or viewers do, and that is that some years ago, the Agricultural Land Commission signed over, through a memorandum of understanding, responsibility for land management to the Oil and Gas Commission. And that all of the oil and gas reserves in BC are in northeastern BC, pretty much. And what it means is that the Oil and Gas Commission, which receives a lot of money from industry in the form of fees and permits, is in charge of determining whether it is useful to install a micro pipeline or a wellhead, a multiple wellhead on agricultural land. The Agricultural Land Commission has sworn off that responsibility. And that is one of the reasons why this process is moving ahead at that end, the beginning end of the supply chain. The second thing is its safety, which is a major feature with fracking. We're talking about safety in the Fraser River and Fraser River Delta. But safety at the other end is also highly compromised. We have talked to people who have been told that if there's a sour gas leak, they just should get some masking tape and tape around their windows and doors, which is a remarkably ineffective thing to do. And there's no warning in advance when these leaks take place, and the communication grid is awful. And I can tell you that the reaction is taking place to Tilbury, because it's in the center of a highly populated area, is pretty dramatic and pretty intense, whereas the reaction to the death by 1,000 cuts taking place in agricultural land, the most productive agricultural land in BC, in the northeast around Fort St. John, is very muted, because there's only about 40 or 50,000 people living there, as opposed to several millions in the lower mainland. So we've got an invisible source leading to a visible endpoint in Tilbury. And I think we need to attack the whole supply chain and some of the structures that allow it to happen in order to make this project not go through.
Okay, thank you, Laura.
Thank you, everyone. I guess I would like to add one final comment, and it's really simple. LNG is not the future of our community. And as a member, I am opposed. It is not the future for our kids. And with our membership being under the age of 35 years of age, without intervening and protecting their future, there is nothing for them. LNG has the potential to destroy life along the Fraser River, LNG and other projects. And at this point in time, I think we all do, as mentioned, have to come together to help stop this project. Thank you.
So I think I'm needing to interject here. We've just had word from our tech support that we're over time and that we have to finish. And so I want to thank Nikki so much for moderating the Q&A. I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to give a special thank you to Elder Christiania for the welcome. And thank you to all of you who joined us on this call. So we are going to be sending you follow-up information. We'll send a link to this video, hopefully some fuller answers to some of your questions that may not have been answered here. And we hope that all of you will join in this fight to stop this project. Thank you so much.